The photo pass was a definite, like that was a career highlight for me, for sure. For sure. Yeah. I mean, just the whole process, like the timing of it with the book coming out and all that stuff was fabulous. Also, the piece has never been shown all by itself, which in a way is, I mean, it's how most artists envision pieces and projects like that. So it was sort of amazing to be able to bring it to life that way with Victor, to be able to do it in the kind of space. I mean, my space is a little bit of a throwback space to the 60s and 70s in New York, and being able to do it in that space in that way was just kind of magic, really magic. And you know, when you work with artists, Victor and I, he's how old is Victor? 81, 80 or 81. He's 81. So he's had many relationships with galleries, with curators, etc. You know, when you come to know an artist at an older age, there's really two big things to grapple with. One is making sure that their new work, the things that they're still producing, are seen by the public, have the kind of exposure that they should have. You know, that people don't go, Victor Bergen, oh, I thought he was dead. And you know, when you have a historic legacy like Victor's, it's also important to sort of balance that against the new work. And very often nowadays you see younger galleries or things, they pick up these older artists, and the first thing they do is they show the older work, the historic stuff that you're familiar with. And I get it, you know, because you're trying to place it in museums and institutions. But I think as a gallerist, you kind of have an obligation to support the artists and their current artistic production. And only after you've proven yourself there and developed a real support system for an artist and the whole of their career, should you have the privilege of showing something like PhotoPath. And so it was nice. It was nice that Victor offered us that opportunity.
But so with Victor, you didn't, your approach was more the previous one you mentioned, which is actually to support his sort of evolving career. And then this was the moment where actually you felt confident enough to go back to a work that was...
This is it was our third show with him, but it was the first time that we'd shown historic work. The other two exhibitions were a video installation and a photo and text-based installation, both of which were brand new work.
That is such an interesting angle, something I haven't actually thought about, or even as a thing that we could be talking about. But I do remember seeing a big show of David Hockney at Tate and being just really impressed with that journey that such an established and well-known artist was confident to take, despite the art world, or despite the sort of system that would have probably just encouraged him to keep producing those sort of flat elevational work from early on in his career, to finding, like, at the end of it, this kind of really exuberant paintings of landscapes.
And just doing what you want to do as an artist, I think, is harder than it sounds when you grow older. You know, there is, as you said, like the art market would probably be just fine with him doing the same sort of thing over and over, you know, steady sales, steady like production, but
recognizable work.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And it is, you know, also, I think now we are at a very interesting place because you know, our relationship to art history, the market's relationship to art history has really grown and changed. And, you know, previously we were very attached to a certain way of thinking about modernism. You know, it was very sort of Hegelian, like this leads to that, leads to this, leads to that. And there's not room for any sort of turnoffs off the major highway. And for just about every artist that you can name, there's a kind of breakthrough moment. You know, it's the moment where they do that first radical thing and they gain recognition, and that's what writes them into the text of art history. And then there are all these secondary texts, right, and museums and things that write about that artist's work later, but it's that one moment, that breakthrough moment, and everything else kind of gets measured against it, and everything else was never quite the same as that, right? And the market always sort of privileged the breakthrough moment because that's what art history texts, that's what the Museum of Modern Art in New York always privileged. And over time, as new generations of scholars have really started to question that, and new generations of art dealers have said, you know, whatever, I've been supporting this artist my whole career, and I know their whole career, and I'm here to tell you that the work that they did in the 1980s is every bit as good, if not more interesting, as what they did in the 1950s. But you know, it takes a real shift in not just thinking about art, but thinking about the structure of how we understand art to make things like that happen. And we're seeing that now. So are you
saying that things are changing, that we can see evidence of
I think so, yeah.
Also within institutions?
So it's easier to change in the market than it is to change in the museum world. And, you know, that's for a whole variety of reasons, right? My name's on the door. I can bring my ethics, my interests, my intellectual idiosyncrasies to bear on what I do there. And if I see an evolution or some change happening, I can shift pretty quickly to adapt to that or to engage with that. And we don't do that for everything, but sometimes it makes sense for us and for who we are and that sort of thing. Museums are bigger institutions. They have different attitudes about the speed at which one works. And that means that they're much slower to respond and they're much slower to change. You know, and nobody likes to talk about, like in the United States, museums are not unlike corporate structures in terms of how you sort of move up, and the idea that there was a glass ceiling that, you know, women could only go so far, so fast. People of color could only go so far, so fast. And that hasn't changed so much. I think they're working on it. And I think it shifts from country to country radically, right? Yeah. They're working on it, but it's slow and it happens more rapidly in some places than in others. I mean, I think about our National Gallery here in the United States, which is run by a woman for the first time ever. And
the National Gallery in Washington, D.C.
Yeah. And when I look at what's going on there in terms of exhibitions, and I talk to the curators there, and I see how they're restructuring departments and things, it's a big change. Okay. I mean, at times in the art market, we laugh out loud and go, oh my God, it's just still so slow, though. It takes like a year to have a conversation that in my world would take 2 weeks. But by the same token, it's not just about getting more female artists into the collection of the National Gallery. It's not just about getting Black artists or Indigenous artists into that collection, because that can happen by virtue of donor, you know, like that can actually happen from the outside in. It's about changing the internal culture so that you don't constantly have to remind people about diversity. It just naturally is. You know, and that happens much more slowly. I mean, if you're at the National Gallery and you're a middle-aged white guy, are you leaving anytime soon? No. And it's our National Gallery is even worse because it's a government job. No, you're not going anywhere until you retire, basically. And so you either have to create new space for younger people, or you have to push
but it's also cultural change, isn't it? That's really important. It's, you know, one thing is that you may be a white middle-aged guy, but if you're part of a system that perpetuates that sort of historical position of a middle-aged guy, that's different to maybe actually attempting to do some good or actually make some change. I mean, it is interesting that as a gallery, you do say that one of your central aspirations is education. And we can talk about that in terms of how you deal with artists or how you present the work and things like that. But maybe we could stay a little bit longer on this idea of educating, but maybe talk about educating institutions. So while we're talking about institution, I think it's interesting that we just got there somehow quite quickly. How can you, from your position of a small gallery, how can you educate? I mean, you can educate the public, you can educate people that, come into your gallery, but how do you educate the system?
Right. I mean, it's hard, and it's hard all the way around, because we have, I mean, first, you have to be willing to ask for help. And second, you have to be willing to give help. Right? You have to be both needy and generous.
Yeah, no, that's such a great point.
And so, from my point of view, we spend a lot more time than some other galleries do on doing museum and institutional outreach. And again, especially in the United States, like, we're a small gallery, we're not White Cube or Pace, so we don't have people all across the globe. So our focus tends to be the United States. I mean, we have some engagement with other parts of the world and certain institutions in, like, in the UK or in France or in Mexico, Canada, but by and large, we're much more focused on this. And the United States is a big place. There are 50 states. Every single one of them has any number of art institutions. So we look there, and we spend a lot more time going out and trying to meet curators and people in museums, and just having a meeting, going to them is huge, right? So if I get on a plane and I go to, Davenport, Iowa. Do you even know where Davenport, Iowa is? Most people don't. Yeah,
but I presume that Davenport is in the middle of it.
Right, but when you get on a plane and you go to Davenport, Iowa to see the Figge Museum, they know that, they remember that, they value the fact that you made that you initiated that. And so you sit down and you talk to them, you say, what are you working on? What are your concerns? And for the most part right now, every time you have a meeting with a museum, they're talking about diversifying their program. They're talking about how it makes sense for them. Again, if you go to Davenport, Iowa, my experience in Davenport, Iowa was like, this place is pretty white. So you have to think about diversity in terms of, okay, what does that mean for Davenport, Iowa? What makes sense there? And then what you try to do is you do a little bit of homework before you sit down to that meeting. You listen to their concerns. And then, having done your homework, you say, here's what I see. And here's some things that might be of interest to you from our program. Like, we have this artist and she's working on this project, or rethinking this multi-channel video that she did with the Sioux Indian tribe that is just north of here, right? And here is, you mentioned that you have this great collection of landscape works, and we have an artist, Jorge Tacla, who has done a whole series of landscapes, sort of global landscapes that deal with catastrophe and, sort of urban renewal, urban destruction and urban renewal, and all that comes with it. Maybe there's some way that we could tie into that. So you kind of start there, and each institution has different needs, has a different community. And so you really have to think about their community. And then galleries are, I think a lot of people don't really realize this, but galleries are patrons of the artists that they represent. So typically in the United States, we're pretty capitalist here. Governments don't support our institutions. So if an institution is interested in a Jorge Tacla exhibition and they think it might make sense, then you sit down and you say, okay, here's a portfolio of people who've written about the work, who he's done panel discussions for, curators who supported the work before. Let's think about what kind of programming we could do. Who could we bring in there? What will this cost? Where do you have money to spend on things like this, and where don't you? And is that an area where the gallery can be of assistance? Most typically, galleries help fund on the education end of things, actually, right? It's things like if there's going to be an exhibition catalog, or they want to bring in a scholar to write about an artist's work.
Mm-hmm.
There's that, a lot of times that money in whole or in part comes from the gallery.
Mm-hmm.
The exhibition catalog doesn't say CRISTIN Tierney Gallery, it says Figge Museum or National Gallery or, or Sarasota Art Museum, whatever it is. But the gallery assists with that. Bringing somebody in from programming, like if somebody wanted you to come speak, if you were going to do a panel discussion with Jorge Tacla and they wanted you in person, they might need the money for a plane ticket and, a hotel or things like that. Having a reception so that when the artist is there, the artist is sort of, properly feted, gets lots of appreciation and love. Galleries do that too. And of course, the upside of that is that usually the museums invite their board members and their donors. And so it helps us connect to people who also might acquire the work, support the work financially, et cetera.
But it sounds like an incredible commitment from your side. So you really are not there just to sell the work. You really are there to, as you've said at the start, to really support the artist. And I just wonder if that is your approach, or that is the approach of many galleries. I mean, I almost feel like the passion with which you speak about, traveling somewhere to, present an opportunity for an institution to engage with your artist is not maybe something that every gallerist would do. I guess it's not something that every gallery would do. It's, in a way, it's older school. It's sort of an old school approach to things. I'm not old, but I'm also not 25. And my gallery's sales are not dependent on art fairs. My gallery's sales and relationships and stuff evolved differently. And so I approach the representation of artists differently. A younger gallerist 5 blocks away, down the street, whatever, has to hustle in a different way. Like, sales matter because they have to pay the rent. Mm-hmm. And I think as those gallerists grow older and start to develop more relationships with museums and institutions, like the best of them kind of move into that world. In the United States, I would say that we have sort of, there's the entry level or emergent galleries where the focus is heavily on sales and, for the first few exhibitions and generating attention for an emerging artist. Yeah. And then there's the kind of mid-level, mid-tier, mid-size, whatever you call it, mid gallery. And that's sort of what I am. And there are a lot of other galleries. I mean, I'm relatively small within that category. There are other galleries that, that do this as well and have for quite some time. And then, of course, there's the mega gallery, and they have entire teams devoted to figuring out what museums and institutions want to show this work and acquire that work and that sort of thing. It is definitely sort of older school. I do think a lot of my colleagues do this, but some don't do as much of it. I come out of, I didn't come up working in galleries when I opened a gallery. That was actually the first time that I worked at a gallery. And I have had the luxury, because of the advisory work that I do and the secondary market work that I do, I have had the luxury of being able to say, we can take a longer view here. Can I just ask what's a secondary market?
Secondary market, meaning art that has a history of ownership. So I sell this Picasso in the back room, and then I don't have to worry if we don't sell a 7-channel video installation by Mary Lucier immediately. I know that's going to take a long time. I know that that's going to sell to a museum or an institution. And I know that I have to be patient about this, but I can do that because I've got this happening in the back room.
Right.
And again, that's an older world approach, but it gives us as a gallery a lot more curatorial freedom. So some galleries can work like this or have, a steady, strong enough client base that they can take that long view. And some just, that's not what they do. That's not what they're about. And when we meet with artists or are thinking about the question of representation, we take it very seriously because it is pretty full service. Actually, I mean, as one of my colleagues jokingly said the other day, we have 2 new people who just started working, and she said to them, never forget that your artists depend on you for many things. And one of the big thing is that we are their doorman. And she looked at them like, what? And she said, most of our artists don't live in doorman buildings, so stuff gets delivered here all day long. You handle a lot of things for artists that I think when you start at a gallery, you probably don't expect to be doing. But that's what you're there for. Your first and most important group of clients is the artist. It's the artists themselves. It's not the buyers, it's the artists. So you take care of them first, and then you take care of all your other clients and your vendors and your other kinds of relationships after that.
I mean, I have a lot of sort of thoughts on everything you've said, but I think maybe the first thing to just clear is actually that your mode of operating also comes from the kind of work that you're showing. So the fact that you are having to sell this Picasso in the back room is actually because of a certain type of work that you're interested in. So maybe we could just explore that a little bit. The very type of work informing the way that you're having to approach, business or your curatorial sort of approach.
Yeah, that's true. That's fair. We represent plenty of artists who paint paintings. And let me just say, thank God for painters, right? I mean, we all joke about it and we all laugh about it, but painting is a lot of the reason that any gallery shows a video work at all, or any kind of time-based media work. And so, so thank God for the painters. But we do show a fair amount of time-based media, and that includes artists who engage and work in performance. We have a lot of video artists. Typically, I mean, most mid-sized galleries kind of have 1 or 2 artists who do video. And we have a much higher percentage. And some of our artists are not strictly, a lot of them are interdisciplinary. So for example, our artist Tim Yude he's engaged in a 15-year performance project to retype 100 novels. It's much more complicated and nuanced than that, but essentially, like right now, Tim is on his way. He might even already be in Chicago, where he will sit at a particular location in Chicago with a folding chair and table and retype a novel that was written many years ago. The manuscript was typed many years ago, and he'll retype it. And he's been doing this for years, and he will continue to do it until he hits 100. And then, if I had to guess, I'd say he's going to say, "I'm going to do another 100." Because that's who he is. So when we take
that's also why he is an artist. That is also why he is that person, right? Exactly. And you have to, being an art dealer requires a lot of faith. It requires a phenomenal amount of optimism, actually. But we can support someone like Tim. In truth, I find most performance artists to be unbelievably low maintenance. But we can support an artist like Tim, because he's also making paintings and drawings. When he's finished with this project, there is a beautiful diptych that we can then place in an institution or sell to a private individual, but also as part of our larger program, we do have those painters and we do have that secondary market stuff. And when I first decided to open a gallery, our very first exhibition was with Peter Campus. I still am not entirely sure what convinced him to do that, since I had no track record of doing any of that sort of thing. But it kind of set him up as a cornerstone, and Peter is a very important artist. And it's easy to say that now, but when we were showing him, he just, the gallery he'd been working with closed in the 2008 financial crisis.
he was at kind of a crossroads. A younger generation didn't know as much about Peter Campus. And so we really had to work with him and think about that. And I mean, first of all, it was really rewarding work. Second of all, I do come out, I mean, I'm ABD at the Institute of Fine Arts. I do come out of a more, I guess, scholarly, nerdy kind of background. A lot of the people I went to school with are at universities and museums across the United States. So there are a number of reasons that this all seemed to make sense. I think the most important one to me is that I think time-based media is the most important medium of the 21st century. Like I honestly believe that artists who are working with time in a whole variety of ways are doing something that's extraordinarily important right now. And so you sell a couple of Picassos or whatever to help support that.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. In what you describe as time-based media, you of course have a limited space to accommodate, not physical space, but space to sort of accommodate different approaches. So how do you then weigh the approaches to something that is so huge as a kind of idea?
It's hard. I mean, it's hard to say exactly. It's kind of organic, I think oftentimes people are like, well, why don't you show this? Or why don't you do this? Or why don't you, and you have to say like, well, I have to make, I can't just wake up one day and say, oh, I'm going to manifest that I'll work with so-and-so. And they're going to call and say, I'm just dying to do a show with you. It takes time to develop the relationships. You also have to, I mean, a gallery program is a little bit like a financial portfolio too. Like, we're talking about time-based media as if it's this huge lost leader in every sense, but it's not. Peter Campus is an artist whose work sells. And a lot of it is institutional placement, but certainly not all of it is. And, if you, like, when I look at our year end, I mean, I do a year-end financial analysis every year. I look at all the places we've sold work to, what we're selling to the artists, both in terms of like how many works, what's the dollar value of the work, how are we extending their legacy, like not just dollar value, but also intellectual value, like what's their capital in that sense. We do a real kind of thorough analysis of that. And people like, I think people sort of forget, like, Peter Campus's work sells. And right now, post-pandemic, we're actually in a world where time-based media has never sold less. Everything is about painting, like obsessively about paintings for the last few years. The exact opposite of what everyone thought would happen during the pandemic happened. Everyone, I mean, all of my colleagues, when we went into lockdown, they were like, it's the golden age for you. You do so much video, you have an amazing amount of content that people can access. And in fact, what happened was this. And that's not the way, it turns out that
is not the time-based media. I think that's really important to acknowledge that.
So it's actually been terrible for time-based media. And yet perversely, that art form and what it's talking to us about is more important than ever and more relevant than ever. But by the same token, we do have a number of artists who have been with the program from the beginning and who are not time-based necessarily. Like, Joe Fig is a great example of an artist who, he's one of the first artists we showed. I've known Joe for almost 20 years, have supported his work in a variety of contexts and in a variety of ways. And he's another cornerstone of our program, right? There's Peter on the one hand and there's Joe on the other hand, and Joe's work is figurative painting. So, the conceptual conceits and elements to Joe's work, I think, marry very nicely with people like Peter Campus. But at the end of the day, this guy does video and this guy does figurative painting. And so you kind of, you build from there. Like, we started working with Mary Lucier when she had been with the gallery for a very long time. When her dealer retired, we started talking to Mary. And one of the reasons that Mary's a good fit for us is Mary's the same generation of people, they evolved at the same moment. Their work is different, but there are a lot of sort of overlaps in terms of who the likely audiences would be. And therefore, when we looked at Mary Lucier and looked at are we going to make an investment in an older artist who's doing time-based media at this moment in time, it made sense to do that because there's a synergy there. And the same holds true for some of the other artists that we've taken on more recently, like, Maureen O'Leary. She too is a painter, but the sort of slightly strange, surrealist kind of feeling of her work very much suits the current moment. And again, there's a synergy, you can think about, okay, well, her work doesn't look like Joe Figg's, but I can see how this person and this person and this person would all be interested in the work, and so on and so forth. And so, you build your program like that. We also obviously think about, and always think about things like gender balance, diversity, etc. When you are a mid-sized gallery and you make a bigger commitment, like if we were just doing like a show here and a show there and a show there, and we weren't sort of fully representing artists, in some ways that would be a lot easier. Because we could just do a show with this person, and then we could do a show with that person, and we don't have to worry about their career long term. But we care about a long-term relationship, and so that means that that change happens more slowly. So, like for example, if you lose one or two artists, or the program changes in one or two directions, and all of a sudden you're like, we're a little shy on women. And on the one hand, I know that's not how you should be thinking, but I'm a woman. I fucking care about that. Like I don't want to betray the sisterhood, and it's easy.
Your duty, you feel a sense of duty, I think.
Right. And also just ethics. It's just, it's the right thing to do. There are so many great artists out there who are women, or who are, of color, or who speak a different language than I do and have a different experience than I do. There are all kinds of practical limitations that then come into play. One is, I might really love an artist's work, but they work like halfway around the world, and they're in a remote location that is very difficult to access, and shipping the work from there to here costs $50,000 every time. I mean, gosh, I can remember doing a show about Brazil that, I mean, the logistics alone were enough to make me retire. So you do have to, you really have to think about those things.
What have you done with the Mary Lucier artwork that was in London? Is it still in storage somewhere in London, or?
The component parts are into the maybe this is another thing, like
by the way, that's what
that's where we met. Yeah. Every one of those installations is a little bit different. So we actually are still storing the shell, largely because it was well made, and also there is an acquisition possibility over there. So we decided it was worth it to hold on to it over there. All of the screens and the players and all that, the players might be in sort of, I don't know, honestly, I own so many media players that it's like, I mean, it's like rabbits in the forest. There are just so many of them. I'm not sure. We might own those media players, and those might be attached.
Are they all attached to the specific works? So presumably those.
No.
Okay.
I mean, in that case, if they're in storage, then yes, they're attached to that particular. But in general, no. I mean, I have a ridiculous, massive amount of technology in storage.
And that technology presumably can facilitate a lot of different work.
Yes. I mean, things like, museums don't have that kind of equipment. And they only some museums do shows like, multimedia shows often enough that they can hold on to that equipment. So we very often, I mean, part of the reason we have so much in storage right now is because we had a whole bunch of museum shows and things all across the country. And it all came, like, they all kind of finished within 2 or 3 months of each other. And now I just live in a land of flat screens. But, so like the Mary Lucier, parts of it are in storage, and then parts of the screen, like the screens and stuff that were inside, we rented those. And one of the reasons that we do that is, one, because it's just cost prohibitive to ship those things. They're very heavy. They're old, the CRTs can be expensive. And also because renting over in the UK comes along, like the company that we rented from also has an incredible amount of expertise. When you have to install something like that in the space of 36 to 48 hours, you need the help. You need that kind of tech support. So we do it differently each time.
I think that was a wonderful work, and I remember that was one of the 2 leaflets that I picked up at that entire event.
Oh, that's nice to hear.
Huge. So, yeah. But there was also something. I mean, the reason why it resonated with me so much was also the architectonic quality of the work. And then, of course, as I sort of researched your, I don't even want to say gallery, but just all the kind of the output over the years, I've also recognized that there is a time-based media that's very much at the core of the work that you show, but there's also something architectural about it. And I don't know if
No, that's true. I mean, we even had in I can't remember if it was 2015 or 2016, Warren James, who is he's an architect and also a curator, an architectural curator, curated a show for us called The Architectural Impulse, that actually just looked at some of our artists, and then he brought in some artists into the exhibition, just thinking about that sort of interest in architecture. Because even like Jorge Tacla, who I mentioned earlier, a lot of his painting revolves around buildings, monuments, architectural spaces, and things like that. And so there's definitely a theme. Another of the artists that we represent, Alois Kronschläger, constructs these sometimes massive, crazy installations. Joan Linder, who primarily works in drawing ink on paper, has done these just enormous, like, drawings that wrap around an entire gallery where she draws the entire space of another space. So definitely we have an interest in
the Mary Lucier's work. The orientation of the screens and the structure that was built was very much, it was very spatial.
Yeah.
It was nice that you then took me to the back of it and showed me some drawings. I thought that was quite amazing, because suddenly something else about the work is revealed. Yeah. Structure of it, and it was really, really beautifully built.
It was, for sure. Yeah, I mean, everybody loves a good behind the scenes tour.
Yes. So what you just said about the Architectural Impulse exhibition maybe links to something that I was also going to ask, and that is to do with the academic approach or sensibility in the workings of the gallery. Can we talk about that a little bit, and where that comes from, or how important it is, even in connection to the Architectural Impulse, sort of bringing a curator or bringing someone who almost academically will dissect the work?
We've done it a number of times in a number of ways where we, again, sort of work with somebody outside. I mean, I do come out of a more academic background, and I'm unusual in that the academic and the advisory, those sort of market end of things, evolved at a similar time and in sort of different way, but married together quite nicely. So I taught for years when Christie's had a master's program, I taught for years in that program. And so, for the rest of my life, I will have certain, like 1907 is the Demoiselle d'Avignon. I will know that forever. It's also Matisse's Blue Nude. 1913 is the Armory Show. Like, some things are just burned into your brain, art historically as touchstones. That really helps me actually day to day, thinking about when I'm in an artist studio, like, what am I going to relate this to? How are we going to connect this to the bigger picture? And then again, I mean, I read a lot. Like, I mean, right now we're in my dining room right now, but my library is enormous. And, you know, there are books where I just look through the pictures and that's great. And then there are books where I really, really read. And I do have a pretty, I do feel pretty comfortable in like what I know and also how well I can research things. So we tend to take each, when we're thinking about like what kind of exhibition are we going to do next, what's the program going to be like, for example, for 2024, what's the program going to be, what are we going to do? We try to achieve some balance. You know, your artists are always like, as literally, you haven't even closed the current exhibition and they're already in their mind thinking, okay, when is my next exhibition? What is it going to be? What am I going to do? When am I queued up? And like older artists, you know, you have to manage their expectations, because in the old days, they would really show almost every 2 to 2.5 years. Nowadays, there's more space in between. Exhibitions tend to be open longer, you know, so you have different conversations with different artists. And then you decide, okay, like what's most important later. So like again, with Victor Bergen is a good example, because we had like David Campany just published a book and it's a marvelous book. Like it's fan-fucking-tastic. It's totally accessible. You know, anybody could pick that book up and read it and understand it to some extent. Art historically, it really tracks the progression of this piece and asks a bunch of important questions and situates it art historically. So, okay, we don't need to do that. But here's what we do need to do. You know, Victor, who is incredibly academic, but is also an older artist. Like, it, you know, if you were making art in the 60s and 70s, you didn't like track every exhibition so carefully for each, you know, you didn't have a database and you didn't track all that stuff. So we needed an exhibition history. I mean, we knew the exhibition history, but we needed it like typed up on a nice piece of paper, thoroughly researched. We needed to double check, make sure we hadn't forgotten everything. Then we needed the literature and the references to this work, which are many and had never all been just compiled into one list before, right? Then you need a working basic description of the piece. Like all of those very simple things had really never been done. David came along, wrote that book. We had a starting point, you know, so then we went back and built this sort of basic structure around the artwork, took 9 bazillion photographs of it, because documentation for a work of art that's temporary is everything. And then we said to Victor, we know how much you hate videos. He hates being in videos. We know that, you know, this is not your favorite thing, but you're going to do it anyway. And you're going to do it because this is about legacy now. You know, like, first of all, this is an opportunity to film this work for people to understand how it was made, how incredibly complicated. I mean, it was a 2-week install. This is harder to do than it looks. We're going to make people understand that. We're going to make people see that. We're also going to provide a kind of documentation so that when this work is acquired by a major museum, they will have this video to look back on and say, oh, they did that, not this. Oh, they did this, not that. So the video, normally for our like videos for selling exhibition, 3 to 4 minutes. This one is almost double that length, which is still really short for something this significant. But we needed to make sure that we had that history presented in a different way. We didn't need to commission somebody to write an essay. We have David's book, and you could do no better than David Campany. We needed visuals. We needed people to understand it. We needed to sort of pull the curtain back. And as I said to you before, it gives them a sort of behind the scenes tour. And then one of the other really important things that we did that's incredible.
I mean, what's amazing is that it's is the fact that also the work is so subtle. You know, the subtleness of it is, and the effort that you put into
it. Yeah.
Just, it's just wonderful.
And it's not, I mean, it's not my effort, like it's my team's effort. Like my director, Candace Muller, turned herself inside out on this project. You know, like, this is going to sound so silly, but like, it's really hard to take a whole bunch of flat photos, match them exactly, no matter how.
Can we just briefly, can you explain the work? Because I think if someone is listening to this, they might not be able to pick.
Sure. So it's basically, the piece is entitled Photopath, and it basically is what it sounds like. It is a line of photographs that mark out a path on the floor. And each segment is the same size. It's not, Victor doesn't dictate what size they are. He dictates the proportions, right? And so it can be made larger or smaller according to the space itself, because part of the point of doing this piece is making you aware of everything around it, right? It's getting you to slow down, look closer, think about the relationship, as you know, as Plato would have said, between the real and the represented. So so you have this set of photographs. It sounds so simple, right? You just take a series, 22 photographs, and then line them all up, but it's not, because you have to get them exactly right. I mean, the building is over 100 years old. That floor is not, it's not flat, right?
The lighting
shifts, everything is changing around you in very small, as you said, subtle ways. And you have to somehow try to account for that. And of course, part of the point of the piece is that you can never account for that. Like, Photopath will never be invisible. It will never be perfect. It will never be. But the challenge of getting it close enough so that you're acutely aware of the subtle, you know, where it's perfect and where it's not, that's a huge part of the work too. So Candace, I mean, she did so much prep work. She reviewed, you know, what kind of mechanism are we going to hold the camera on? Who's the right photographer to work with Victor on this? How are we going to do a dry run? Which direction is it going to go? You know, all those sorts of things. We had meetings beforehand so that Victor could recount to us how they'd done it in the past. Do we want to do this in black and white or color? Which sounds so silly, but you know what? Until David's book, I had never fully reflected and realized, oh snap, the photos were black and white in the 70s. Like, it looked totally different than it does now. In
the 70s, the photographs printed on the floor would have been black and white.
Or black and white. So there was
obviously the photograph of the work is black and white, so you don't acknowledge, you don't really, yeah. I
mean, so you always saw the difference, right? You were looking at it differently, but in 2023, do you do it in black and white and like, do you make it historic, or do you make it contemporary, or do you shift it, use color, use the technology that we now have so that the conversation is both the same and different? We opted to do color, which was hard. And I don't even want to tell you how many thousands of dollars we spent in photo proofs. But because you don't get it right the first time.
But something that is, again, like the most subtle but obviously beautiful piece of work.
It is an amazing piece, but it's very hard. It's very complicated. I mean, the photo printers came on site and spent an hour with Candace, like literally putting this photo down and then this photo down and talking about, this is too green, this is too that. Okay, there are windows at the front of the gallery. We wanted the windows open, but that means that the light on that front half is going to change every day over the course of the day. And the same is true for the back end, but it'll be the opposite of, you know, I mean, so complicated. And again, like Candace, she knew what she was in for. She knew, you know, some of this is experience, technical know-how. You know, in New York, when you're someone like Candace, you just learn how to do a lot of things you never expected you would need to know. But also, again, like I said earlier, you can't be shy about asking for help, and you can't be shy about being generous with your help. And that's what makes the piece work. You know, Candace is never shy about calling the photography studio and saying, I need you down here. I need your help. I need more from you than I'm getting. And they respond to that. Like, if you're a photo printer, who doesn't want to work on a project like this, right? It's exciting, it's interesting, it's the kind of stuff that got you started doing what you do. Then after all of that, Candace sat down and typed up, this is how, like,
how we did
here's
it.
the backstory of how we did what we did. Here are some of the questions we had and the choices that we had to make. Here's why we made them. Here's what I would do differently. Here's what, so that there's a kind of standard operating procedure. Because when we sell PhotoPath, right, what we're selling is a tiny little index card that just has a basic set of instructions typed on it. That's 4 or 5 lines long. Like it says almost nothing. But Victor has done the piece a number of times and has thought about the piece, and clearly in his mind, there's a certain way of doing it that is closest to the artist's intent. And so Candace made sure that she put together something that would document that would honor that, and that would also carry forward, so that when Victor is no longer with us, his intent is. And so that's what goes into, that's the more intellectual academic approach.
Yeah, absolutely is. There's also something interesting. I think a lot of people don't quite understand that the time-based media, which actually the path is, has that sort of instructional element in terms of how do you reproduce that. And in a way, it ends up as an instruction rather than as the sort of physical.
If I had $1 for every person at an art fair who said things to me like, so what do you actually buy? All day on the Saturdays and Sunday, we answer that question.
So Christine, how do you then sell it? Just sell that piece of paper.
Being an art dealer is like, is somewhat evangelical. Some of this is that you have to convince someone that the intellectual value of this artwork has a financial value, and that, that spending that kind of money on a work of art is worth doing it. It is for the greater good. It is for the betterment of culture. And also it is important to support artists who do work like this. And one of the best ways that you can support artists who do like things like this is buy their artwork. So it takes time, and with some works we have the freedom to sell anywhere, and with other works we have restrictions. Like right now we have a show of Dred Scott's work up, and 2 of the works in the show are restricted sale, which means that we can't sell them to just anybody. We have to sell them to museum/cultural institutions. And if a museum wants to acquire a work, great, perfect, best case scenario, but the whole thing is a conversation with the artist. And if another institution that's not a straight museum, somebody other than like the National Gallery or the Metropolitan Museum of Art or whatever, if it's a private foundation that sometimes does exhibitions, I'm still inclined to sell it to them because I'm an art dealer, but we have to have that discussion with the artist and actually say, we think this is an appropriate and good placement for this work because of X, Y, and Z. Do you agree? So with something like PhotoPath, that's a restricted sale. We're not selling it to a private person. It has to go to a museum.
Presumably those conversations, you said that even having a conversation about, even having a friendly chat with an institution takes a long time to organize and prepare for. But presumably selling a work to an institution is even more of a...
It can take a long time. And the funny thing is that you're constantly, I feel like art dealers are like bats. Like they have this sort of crazy radar that's always like, like you're like, I smell a curator somewhere. Hold on, let's look around and see if we can track them down or whatever. Because you never know when a curator will get funding for something, or when the winds will change and they'll suddenly need X, Y, or Z, or when they have an exhibition and they're going to curate the artist's work into that exhibition. And then that is frequently a way in which artworks end up in a collection, is they're exhibited, people get interested, curators, line up behind the work and say, this is really important. And then it gets accessioned in. So yeah, you're constantly on a mission. And I can remember when I first started, I knew that museum acquisition.
Sounds very unsettling, though.
What?
It sounds very unsettling, your job.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, I guess so. It's definitely not a job for everybody. You're constantly, I mean, I'm a very, I would say I'm a pretty mellow, relaxed person on the whole. And I do think you need to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there are times, like cash flow at a gallery is insanely erratic. And especially like the last 4 years, financial projections are laughable. I mean, you're like, I don't know, let's just try that. Yeah. I don't know anymore. I don't know what's going to happen. Like we have no income. Oh, but we also have no expenses. So actually everything's working out fine. That was the pandemic in a nutshell. Like, oh my God, we're not selling everything. Oh, but actually we don't have any expenses. And then fabulously wealthy people started getting bored and everybody started going online, and all of a sudden you were selling art again, and and everything just kind of worked out magically. But who knew, who knew that was going to happen? You definitely have to be able to adapt, and every day, I mean, every day I get a text message that I look at and go, oh shit, or like, oh, really? Okay, all right, well, okay, fine. Yeah, I mean, it helps to be good-natured for sure.
On this thing that you mentioned about new media and, well, time-based media, but also this sort of clicking and scrolling, is there any opportunity that you can start to see in that sort of erratic scrolling?
In the scroll? Well, opportunity is a hard word. I mean, on the one hand, one thing that has really changed that has been helpful is the rise of the viewing room. And people aren't using viewing rooms as much anymore for like online exhibitions or things, but we can now create a viewing room and have video excerpts and moving image live on that, live in that viewing room, and it can live there for a long time, and that link can be used anytime. And because of the pandemic, because curators and clients got so used to that, like if I had done that in 2018, lots of people would never click, just wouldn't get there. But now we can do that. We can do that a lot. And, you can put together a kind of proposal like, oh, you're interested in an exhibition of Janet Biggs and her multi-channel pieces and some single channel. Great. We'll put something together and then we'll send it to you. And you can do it in 24 hours. So in that sense, in terms of like outreach and communication, definitely there's a lot more opportunity than there was 4 years ago. In terms of art, I mean, I'm not the artist, so it's hard for me to say, but I do think that there are some artists and some people who are, who are thinking about the small screen differently. And I think it's only a matter of time before we see some really interesting artistic projects that deal with the small screen as opposed to a flat screen or the computer screen or, any other kind of screen. One thing that we did last year, I don't even know what year it is anymore. Last year, we had the curator, John Hanhart, come in and curate a show. John Hanhart is, he is the greatest time-based media curator in the United States. I mean, he started things that he worked at the Walker, helped them start their time-based media, worked at the Whitney for decades. That is why the Whitney has the extraordinary film and video collection that it has. Then he went to the Guggenheim for 10 years and built then, and he's consulted for the Smithsonian. I mean, half of the institutions, certainly on the East Coast, John Hanhart has had a hand in helping them develop and build a collection. And he's a lovely guy, and he is just a curious and engaged person. Like, he's exactly what you want a curator to be like. And, you know, even after all this time of working in this field, he's still interested in kind of discovering things and rethinking things. And so during the pandemic, John gets himself an Instagram page and starts looking at other Instagram pages and kind of rediscovers an artist, Luca Bavoli, whose work he had known decades ago, and was sort of interested in the way that Luca was using his Instagram page to sort of feed you bits of a video that, you know, works in progress, time in the studio, but the way that he was sort of constructing this world around his Instagram page. So last year, John curated a show of Luca's video works and some of these drawings and installations in our gallery as a result of that whole discovery and the sort of building of that relationship through Instagram. And so while the piece itself only lives in some ways on Instagram, the exhibition and the way that they work together and all of that developed entirely through social media. You know, and that to me was quite interesting.
Yeah. I mean, even in the Peter Campos show, the latest one, Meditations, there was something, I felt it was something that could live on a smaller screen, and it could be almost like a slow version of sort of social media. It could be something that, yeah. So I felt like there is a potential there for some sort of translation. It just needs to be done, I guess, carefully and
carefully, right? Yeah, I mean, and also, you know, there has to be a balance. Like, one of the reasons that a lot of artists don't do too many projects like that is because they can't control how the work looks, what happens to it. You know, it gets out into the world and becomes viral. So you either have to be okay with that as an artist, or you're not, and therefore you don't do those projects. And also, you know, it's a question that everybody sort of acts like kind of shouldn't be asked, but absolutely should, is how is the artist getting paid for that? How is the artist getting compensated for that? I'm not saying that artists should, you know, get rich and fly net jets because of the amount of artwork they're selling or anything like that, but it's fair. It's you know, a lot of times with time-based media, there's this perception. I mean, curators say it to me all the time. They're like, oh, from Electronic Arts Intermix, I got so many single channel videos for like, I mean, they were like $800 a piece. It's amazing. Instead of that. And, you know, on the one hand, you're like, I'm glad your institution is benefiting from that. And on the other hand, you're like, and that's why all of my artists still have day jobs. And, you know, the idea that they will spend $200,000 on a 35-year-old figurative painter's work, but they couldn't spend $10,000 on those single channel works, knowing that the money goes to the, you know, that would support that artist's work more fully, is actually really something to think about.
Would you recommend to a young time-based media artist to be protective of their work, or to let the work?
I would recommend that they be protective of their work, absolutely. And but also think about how you want the work to get out there. Like, it's possible to show parts of your work, or to sometimes create works that live out in the world, that live on Instagram, or that live out in the digital realm, that you don't get compensated for, that you're not going to see payment for. But that needs to be part of a larger plan. You know, don't be careful with that, because there comes a point where no one thinks that they should pay for your work, including museums and institutions. In fact, they are the first to say, why do we have to buy this when we could access it other ways? And the days of time-based media artists receiving, you know, generous stipends and honoraria and things like that are coming to a close. So I do think it's important. I do think it matters. I mean, we work closely with our artists who do video in particular to say, let's do this and not that. Let's think about it this way and not that way. Addition this, not that. it's important. And I mean, I would also say too, not just for time-based media artists, but for most artists, 95% of practicing artists and artists who you see in galleries, they have a day job.
Yeah.
And they may be able to support themselves for a period of 5 or 10 years on the sales of their work, or a couple of years, but there's a lot of ebb and flow to that. So, you want to,
when you say,
manage everybody's expectations. And
when you say day job, that usually means that they're in academia.
Not always, but yeah, a lot of, like, a number of artists teach, although some of them teach in sort of unusual ways or situations, especially, nowadays. Like one of our artists, Melanie Baker, actually teaches at the 92nd Street Y, and it's like the most impossible class to get into. And she's taught there for years, but it gives her a lot of flexibility and a lot of freedom and a lot of time in her studio. So that really makes sense. Another one of our artists down in Guadalajara is actually part owner of a hamburger joint. And it does well. And so crazy conceptual projects are offset by hamburgers.
But they do exactly what you do, selling that Picasso in order to.
Yeah. It's an avocation, not a vocation.
One final thing that I have on my notes here is something that we didn't quite mention, but I also feel it's very strongly present in all the work that you show and all the artists that you represent. There is also something observational in the work that you show. I was recently writing something about Stanley Kubrick, and I came across a quote where he says that observation is a dying art. But then in the work, and one of the reasons why the work that you show resonates with me is that it actually is very observational. So the Mary Lucier observations of Paris, to Peter Campus's meditations, to the Victor Bergen's just an observation of
right.
So I just wonder whether there is anything you can sort of reflect on when it comes to this notion that whether art is of the world or in the world, and
right. I've never thought about the program in terms of that notion of observational, but I actually really like it, and I'm totally stealing it for sure. That's absolutely going into some pitches. I do. I mean, I do think I like art like that. And even in a lot of the painting, not necessarily in the time-based media, but even a lot of paintings, like if I think about Maureen O'Leary and what draws me most powerfully to her work, I mean, I love the way she paints. I love her use of color, her sort of use of color. She's thinking both art historically, and also we don't live in a world where where things have to be naturalistic anymore. Like, I like that, but I also like the way that there's always there are small little things there that if you spend a little time, you see them and you notice them. The paintings that we have on view right now by Marmon and Borens in our downstairs gallery, I'm absolutely obsessed with them. Because they reward careful looking. The sort of more time you spend with them, the more you go, oh my God, wait, what? In fact, opposite me on the other wall right now is a Marmon and Borens painting from years ago. It's on the other wall in the dining room here, and it is such an incredible piece to me still to this day, because it's so deceptively simple. And it tricks my eye every time, and I have to stand there and stare at it and then like back away and go, okay, nope, yep, okay, got it, I remember now. I mean, I am the kind of person who my sister was very heavily into music growing up, and I was more interested in the visual. And so we've always had these kind of interesting conversations, and we were talking about this recently, and she was talking about how I used to have this crazy friend in high school who he's a photographer now, And we're both observational like that. And, you know, she remembers coming, we were sitting out by the pool in the backyard, and she came out and she was like, what are you two doing? And I said something like, you know, I was actually just watching the way that that leaf on that tree keeps bouncing and the light just keeps shifting, and how rhythmic it is, you know. And then he was lying on the diving board, and yeah, I was just thinking about how our lives always go back to water. And she was just like, what? Like we weren't even talking to each other. We were in this sort of weird little world where I'm staring at a leaf and he's looking down, like on the diving board, staring at the water and the reflection. And who the hell knows how long we were sitting there doing that. But obviously, that was always there somehow, you know. And still to this day, I get up in the morning and I do, like, one of my great pleasures in life is I get up and I go outside and I walk in my nice big backyard, and I look at light and how it's reflecting, and just what most people I think would say is I'm staring at nothing at all for a really long time.
I think it's nice that we're not going to get to see the painting that you're looking at that's in front of you.
I can turn it
No,
around.
I think maybe it's good not to. Let's imagine it. But maybe I want to ask you about the painting that's behind you.
Oh, yeah. That's Ryan McGinnis.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, this has lived with me for quite a long time. Ryan and I are old friends now. I mean, I guess I'm at the point in my life where it seems like everybody's an old friend, but yeah, we've been friends for a long time. And this is, I mean, it's quite riotous, isn't it? Like, it's just 1,000 layers of silk screens, all different images, and it's very fragmented in one sense, but it's also just an incredibly elegant, beautiful composition. And this is another work that, I mean, every time I look at it, I discover